Hi, I'm Elaine Engelhardt from Utah Valley State, and welcome to class today. The class is Ethics and Values, and today we're moving on to one of our brilliant contemporary philosophers, John Rawls. A specialist in Rawlsian theory is Michael Minch, who's joining us here today from the philosophy department.
Good to be with you.
Welcome, welcome. Yeah. And let me tell you a little bit about our students who are here. We've got John and Luke, and over here we have Carrie and Rhonda. So thanks so much for joining us. And for some of the students who don't know much about you, would you tell us about yourself, Michael?
Sure. Well, I've been here at UVSC since 2000 now, so for quite a while, and I love it. And I get to do what I've always wanted to do, which is teach moral theory and ethics and political philosophy and engage students. So it's wonderful.
And I know you like sports. You have some children who enjoy playing sports. And
I do, yeah. My son just got a baseball scholarship to college elsewhere, unfortunately, but anyway. So,
well, congratulations.
Yeah.
So some fun hobbies outside of studying political philosophy
like
and other interesting areas.
Hike and things like that.
Oh, well, great. Well, you and I both like John Rawls. He has really filled an important void for me, and I know that many of us were just waiting for his book to come out, A Theory of Justice. And when it did come out, it was very hard to read. And I think, perhaps the more we read it, it becomes much more accessible. But for you students who are reading this as part of the class, this is another one you'll need to read a few times. But Mike and I are going to give you our best discussion of it so that we kind of narrow down some really good points about Rawls that'll help you understand why he's such an important philosopher. And Mike, what is it that you like so much about Rawls?
Well, I suppose what I like about Rawls is what most people like about him. He created a Rawls industry. He created the most important political theory of justice in the 20th century. And it spawned just a fabulous amount of thinking through a lot of questions that had been ignored for a long time. And so it's that kind of genius which enabled an entire generation of political theorists to reinvigorate their work.
I couldn't agree with you more, and it really has added to the scholarship of many of us, including both of us. It's part of my dissertation, and I think probably part of yours as well.
It is, yeah.
And unfortunately, John Rawls died in 2002, but was a very esteemed professor at Harvard University up to that point. And I'd like to ask the students to tell me a little bit about what they like about Rawls. So move over here with Luke and John, and then I'll come over to Carrie and Rhonda.
I think the thing that I like best about him is that it is very difficult to read, like you said, and he gives us the original position, which is what our reading is on today, and it is, I think it's an excellent sort of heuristic device for making it much easier to understand. As to how much it adds or subtracts from his total theory and so forth, regardless of all that, it makes it much easier to understand the concept for anybody, and you can get very lost reading anything that he writes, but at least you can grasp that, I think.
Thank you. And how about you, John?
I know that Rawls is still using kind of a social contract theory for much of his work, and I like that about him. I also like that he is hugely influential on contemporary liberalism, and he is kind of, in that way, hugely influential on contemporary politics. So.
He is. He's still making those contributions. And how about you, Carrie?
I think he's just brilliant in talking about the topic of justice.
He is. He's just made such a strong contribution on justice, and justice is such a tricky area, but so important in ethics. And Rhonda, how about you?
Well, as a legal studies student, I appreciate the fact that that the basic rights and duties for each person is based in equality and justice.
And Rawls is a huge supporter of this as well. Okay, well, can you tell us a little bit about social contract theory and some of those who have gone on before John Rawls, maybe John Locke?
Sure. Well, the idea of a contract is a heuristic device or imaginary device that political theorists began to employ in the 17th century to try to understand the relationship people have to one another in a political society so that they can pursue their own ends and yet not kill each other. And so the fountainhead of all social contract theory is Thomas Hobbes, and following Hobbes is Locke, who elaborated many Hobbesian ideas, and then Rousseau, and then Kant. And then you have the social contract theory ignored until John Rawls. And so Rawls comes along in the 20th century and revives this heuristic, this tradition, in what he calls an act of Kantian constructivism, whereby he writes very explicitly against utilitarianism and invokes Kant on every other page, and creates an elaborate and sophisticated system that he really carried forward in respect to three works, not only Justice, which was published in '71, but then taking into consideration all the critique it received. In 1993, he wrote Political Liberalism, in which he extended his ideas, elaborated, clarified some things. And then in 2002, Justice is Fairness, a Restatement, which is sort of the Reader's Digest version of both of those previous two books put together, a little bit simpler to read, shorter, and a restatement, and in which he again clarifies some of his ideas. And so it's this contemporary contribution to this long-standing theory, which is of utmost importance in liberal Western political theory.
You know, I'm so glad that you brought out these points, Michael, because first of all, we need to say, as a social contractarian, then he does not follow Hobbes. Hobbes is very ego-centered in his approach, and Rawls is going to tell us specifically in his books that he does not believe in that. So there are areas of social contract theory certainly that he builds on, but he's not a Rawlsian, he's not a Hobbesian. Also, he's going to tell us he's not a utilitarian, because greatest good for the greatest number can truly privilege unfairness because of this notion of who gets to decide. And invokes Kant a lot, but would like to say he's not solidly a Kantian, but many of us say, yeah, you are. Anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. That is, that he builds on the previous contract theory and doesn't simply mirror any of it. So, for example, in respect to Hobbes, one of the similarities is that he thinks that individuals are rational actors who pursue their own ends and are justified in so doing, but they have particular kinds of constraints and mutual interests, which isn't very robust in Hobbes, which I think is what you were saying, and so it's a culmination of the theory, the social contract theory, which I don't think we'll ever see again. I mean, there are improvements to be made on Rawls's theory, but not by going back into the contract tradition and trying to work in that idiom. I think he's made that idiom about as pristine as it can be. Okay,
thank you. Well, as we move on into our reading for today, let's pull up this first graphic, and then we'll talk a little bit about maybe the overall message that we also find in this text. So would you pull up the first graphic, and John, would you read that for us?
Yes. Foundations of Justice. John Rawls believes that each person possesses an inviolability founded on justice that even the welfare of society as a whole cannot override. Therefore, the rights secured by justice are not subject to political bargaining or to the calculus of social interests.
Thanks, John. And basically what he's getting at then with this foundation of justice is that each one of us and all of the social primary goods, which he would include as liberty and opportunity, income and wealth, and the basis of self-respect, are to be distributed equally unless, and here's the big unless, an unequal distribution of any or all of these goods is to the advantage of the least favored. So this is going to be also his statement that he's going to pull in as he's talking about justice as fairness. And let's go ahead and add just a little more to this quote, and then have some of you tell me a little bit about how you perceive, what you perceive he's saying in this statement. So Rhonda, would you read the next part for us?
For Rawls, in justice as fairness, the original position of equality corresponds to the state of nature in the traditional theory of the social contract.
Okay, thank you. So here we have Rawls telling us that we have some very strong principles, and this is what I'd like to establish. Michael, do you want to tell us a little bit about why this is so important?
Well, it's important because it's the heart of his theory. You know, he has two basic rules that he theorizes as constitutional, that is, unchangeable, in respect to which all other rules must comply. That is, they can't contradict them. The one is equal freedom for all, maximum freedom for all, but equal freedom for all, or as he puts it in his later work, the most extensive set of liberties possible that all people can have. But then the difference principle that in respect to primary social goods, all people deserve an equal distribution unless an unequal distribution is to the advantage of the least advantaged. Now, it's important to note that something might be to the advantage of the least advantaged and to everyone else's advantage too. It just has to be at least to the advantage of the least advantaged. And I think you mentioned this as the famous, this is the difference principle, and it's probably, in addition to the original position, that theorization, the most debated aspect of Rawls' theory.
All right. So what might cause these debates, Luke, this difference principle, with this difference principle?
I think part of it is that there are certain things that Rawls doesn't spell out entirely, right? We get from that he's not a communist, but we don't know, how much he's redistributing things. It's not a real fixed point, There's this idea that you have to redistribute things unless having an inequality is to the advantage of everybody. But what exactly does that mean? When are the situations? The application is kind of tricky.
Thank you. Anyone else like to add to this? All right, very good.
Good one.
Okay, I'll get you talking some more with some examples, so we'll move into some of those. But Rawls is going to move into his notion of the good versus the right, Michael, and he's going to talk about that a person's good is that which is, well, we even talked about this when we did Aristotle, but the person's good is needed for the successful execution of a rational long-term plan of life, given reasonably favorable circumstances. So looking for the good of the person and also looking for the overall good of society. So good having dual connotations. And then rights. So what kind of goods are we entitled to, and what kind of rights might we be entitled to?
Okay. Well, Rawls...
Real simple question, isn't it?
Well, Rawls's theory, of course, is a liberal theory, and in responding to the critique of the theory of justice, he wrote Political Liberalism to clarify that justice is political, not metaphysical. And so the priority of the right over the good is of central importance to Rawls's theory. That is, that we all have our conceptions of the good, and those are not to be violated by others. They're very important to us. They're sacrosanct to us. For some of us, they're,
it's your old plan of life, isn't it?
It's your plan of life. It's why you believe you're living life. It's, and all that. And so he imagines a liberal democratic society in which everyone's sense of the good for their lives has as much space available as possible for them to pursue that and live that. But there are rights, a structure of rights that guarantee us the opportunities we have to pursue what we believe is good.
And those basically come to us through social contract.
Those come to us through the liberal democratic deliberation that he imagines taking place behind a veil of ignorance
It
in
does.
an original position.
Has to be tied to that. Can you emphasize that for our students who are watching at home? So then this notion of the right, it needs to be, it's the social contract that needs to be tied to the original position and the veil of ignorance then.
Yeah, well, it's tied to it in the sense that he imagines that as being the best way for us to understand how it is we would come up with justice as fairness, the rules that we would agree to shape our lives, that we would live our lives by in common in a political association. But he also recognizes that all the rules that a society will generate are not going to be generated in an original position behind a veil of ignorance. Those are the constitutional rules that aren't going to be changed. But democracy is a project always, you know, in progress. And so I should look over here too, I guess.
Yeah, I didn't mean to separate the men from the women over here either.
You know, he realizes that in a democratic society, and he refers to the kind of society as not as a communist one, as Luke mentioned, but as a property-owning democracy. And so he understands that we will always be in process of deliberatively with one another agreeing to what it is we want to do in our society. But there are fundamental principles of right or rights that create a framework from which we can't escape. We wouldn't want to escape the right of free speech, the right of free worship, the right of participation in the economy and in politics and pursuing our life plans and so on. And those rights are roughly synonymous with what most human rights theorists think of as human rights.
Very good. Now, do you have any questions on this? Because we brought up two very important principles. We talked about a person's good, and then we talked about a person's rights. So any of you have questions on where the delineation might fall on that? Because sometimes we're slicing the bologna pretty thin. I shouldn't call it bologna, should I? But sometimes...
Salami, I would.
Yeah.
I do have a question, actually.
Okay.
If I can articulate it. It seems to me that Rawls is somewhat concerned with, in the United States, we believe very much in equality of opportunity. And he pushes it maybe just a little bit further than that in many respects, to where we're considering issues like the fact that somebody might be disabled or not have certain natural endowments that will disadvantage them, and that equality of opportunity just doesn't address that issue. Do you think that he addresses it adequately? Because I've read that some people argue that he doesn't weigh those sorts of things strongly enough, if that makes sense.
I think I understand what you're saying. I would put it this way, Luke. I would say that Rawls takes equality of opportunity so seriously that it looks to some persons, some liberals, to his right, as though he, how can I put this? That he's a socialist of some kind or what have you. But the issue is this, that he realizes that in all human lives there are a wide set of contingent historical factors that shape our lives, about which we have no control and no merit. And so some of us are very advantaged because of the families we were born into and raised into and so on. And some of us are very disadvantaged for the same kinds of reasons. And so he thinks that all advantages and disadvantages that are a part of our lives that have nothing to do with what we control and what we've earned, what we deserve, but are arbitrary and random from a moral point of view, they should be accounted for. And so if we accounted for them, that is, if we sort of did our best to eliminate the harms done to people in this random and arbitrary way, and the benefits given to people in random and arbitrary ways, then people really would have, just insofar as we can do that, equal opportunity in life. And that's what his theory is built toward. That's what he wants. He doesn't presuppose that persons who squander their time and squander their resources should have as big a house or as a high-paying a job as other people. but he is concerned about people who never really do have equal opportunity because of these random and arbitrary contingent factors in all of our lives. And from a moral point of view, it's important to account for those and ameliorate them.
Yeah.
And Rhonda has a question for you as well.
Oh, well, it's more of a statement or an experience. You know, I've mentioned this in other classes that I've been in, and it's one of the things that I don't think is seen today as often as it's been seen in the past. For instance, you know, I was a 9 or 10-year-old child growing up in Michigan, and as my mother took me downtown to get our hair cut, the Ku Klux Klan came walking through. And it was at that time that I was able to experience and see the absolute fear and disadvantage of the blacks who lived in that city, who were walking up and down the sidewalk, and who all of a sudden, and I didn't know as a child what was going on, who grabbed, you know, gravitated towards the walls, who hid in the alcoves, whose fear was seen in the eyes. And I was able to see then the injustice, the inequality, those kinds of things I think that we're talking about here.
I think you're absolutely right, and it's such a good example, Rhonda, because he does expect the good, that we would have a life plan, and some of those goods become rights, but you should have the good to self-esteem. You should have the good to liberty and to opportunity, and those also become rights. And when we see something like this happening, then it's absolute injustice in society. Anything you'd like to add to Rhonda's example there, Mike?
Well, that's a sticky wicket for liberal theory and for Rawls too, because his theory strongly argues for and indeed presupposes that people are equal and free in respect to one another. And so, of course, given Rawlsian theory, African Americans should not in any way be the objects of ridicule or discrimination or harm of any kind simply because they're African Americans and so on. But at the same time, you know, the first principle of his theory is that all people have freedom robustly, as much as they can have, no more than anyone else. And so certainly in those freedoms he imagines we ought to have, as in all liberal theory, is a freedom to free speech. And so democratic societies, like the one Rawls envisions, argues within itself about how to balance free exercise of speech against harm done to people, and how to gauge and measure and understand certain kinds of harms. And so I don't really know what Rawls, I think Rawls would say that if a particular community in Michigan would like to make it very difficult for the Ku Klux Klan to get a permit so that they can march through town, that community ought to be able to put that kind of obstacle in front of the Ku Klux Klan. Whereas, for example, he would argue against, I imagine, a kind of illegality in respect to the Ku Klux Klan.
Well, and as I said, that was in the 60s.
Yeah. Well, still, the problems still continue.
And it does continue still.
And it's a very good response. Thank you. When we ended our last graphic, we had brought up this notion of an initial situation that's fair. We were talking about what could be an initial situation. So let's have Carrie read our next graphic, and that's going to talk about one of Rawls' most brilliant points called the original position. And Carrie, could you read that for us, please?
Yes. Among the essential features of the situation is that no one knows his place in society, his class position or social status, nor does anyone know his fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence, strength, and the like. I shall even assume that the parties do not know their conceptions of the good or their special psychological propensities.
All right, so Michael, this is a very important point that we come to with Rawls, because he's known for this concept of the original position, and he's going to put all of us behind this original position and says, you don't know who you are. So behind this original position, would you be making different decisions? John, do you think you might be making decisions that are different behind the veil of ignorance?
Absolutely. I mean, also, I don't know what kind of person I would be if I were to be born into a different family and a different economic status, and that's going to affect the way that my life is significantly depending on that. And so it's almost like you've got to remain in this position of the veil of ignorance to kind of counterbalance the idea that you are privileged because of a certain economic status. So, and yeah, I do. I think I would make very different decisions. I don't know.
All right, and Luke, let me take it a step further than what John said. If a student is writing a paper and they're going to use Rawls as a philosopher to support the point that they're making, how would they use the original position, do you think, to get across the point in their case?
If they're talking about a specific, case study, then you can say what the individual should do based on the original position, not knowing that was going to be their station in life or the other person's station in life, whatever the case may be, and go from there.
Thank you. And quite often is used as a supporting philosopher in papers. Comments over here before we ask Michael to tell us about the original position. So, hot dog. What is great about this original position? Why is it something that we really enjoy teaching?
Well, it's meant to elaborate and to complexify and make us see very clearly what he believes our own moral intuitions already are. And I think that's its strength, in that it sort of draws out of us our own moral intuitions. That if we can imagine ourselves in a situation where we don't know the factors of our life that will advantage us or disadvantage us, we very clearly would simply want to even out all the rules so that everybody has the same probability of prospering or not prospering, all things being equal. It's sort of a all things being equal metaphor and an all things being equal mechanism. And that's what it really is. And that strikes us all as profoundly moral, or as he would put it, fair. We don't want to be disadvantaged because of our height or our gender or our religion or what have you. And so if we are under some kind of possibility of being disadvantaged, we realize that putting ourselves in a place where we escape that possibility puts other people in a place where they also escape that possibility. And that's a risk we're always willing to take. That is, if helping myself helps you too, I'm happy to help you too. And that's the purpose of the original position.
Okay, and let's do a case study to kind of pull this out just a little bit. And we'll say that I am a very sick child, okay? And really good kid. And this is curable, but it's going to be very expensive, take a lot of money. And we'll say that Mike's my dad, and he gets a 29-hour job at a fast food restaurant. And Rhonda here's my mom, and she has some chronic illness problems, and so she can work doing transcription at home, probably pulls in about 15, 20 hours a week. And then we've got Carrie here, who is a very wealthy child, and she's got the very same illness that I do, very same illness. And her parents over here have extremely good jobs.
She's adopted.
Her parents over here have extremely good jobs, extremely good insurance, and very wealthy. So now we start wondering, well, what are the differences between me as a very ill child and Carrie as a very ill child? And we get behind the veil of ignorance, and none of us know who we are. And suddenly, any of us could be that very ill child or the parents who would like to do it. And I specifically put the father of the child at a place where he's making money, but he's not getting insurance. He's 29 hours a week. And so everything seems pretty desperate because he's really not available for government aid unless he wants to quit his job and do some other things that don't seem so pleasant. now what I'd like to do is change your position, and we'll just move to, and now you're someone completely different. And suddenly you can see behind this veil of ignorance that you are someone different, and do you have a different interest in here? And that's what Rawls would like you to do. You do not know who you are, you don't know your social standing, you don't know birth, parents, you don't know talents, you don't know if you can hit a baseball great like Michael Minch here, his son.
Not me.
There are so many, you don't know anything about yourself, but you do want to have a fairness, a justice as fairness for everyone. So how do you feel about that case study, Rhonda? How does that, what do you think about that?
Well, it's interesting because I actually firsthand understand that circumstance. Remember in the recent past talking to a friend and explaining to her the difference between take two people who both have cancer, a really bad cancer, and you take the person who has enough money, enough resources to not only take care of the chemotherapy or the medications or those kinds of things, and not have to worry about the background of their lives, that the money that they have takes care of those background things. And then take another person, I can take myself, as one of those persons who has the same cancer, but I don't have the money, to take care of the medication, and I don't have the money that is going to take care of the chemotherapy in the same manner, because in the background of things, I worry, because I can't take care of those things. And it puts me in a total different spot. Do you understand what I'm talking about?
Sure. Sure do.
And so, it's a very different thing between having the same illness and not having the same circumstances or resources to take care of that.
Thank you. Good point. Luke, did you have a comment as well?
Yeah, I think for me, it's easiest for me to conceptualize this in thinking, what if everybody before we were even born into the state, could decide what it was going to be like? Because that's for me the easiest way to imagine that I wouldn't even know what my psychological propensities were and all those sorts of things. To just think, what if before you were even born, not knowing who you would be born to, where you would be born, whether you would be handicapped and so forth, how would you design a system? And I really think that if you think about it that way, you come up with what Rawls gives us here.
All right, Michael.
Well, I think, Elaine, your
Case.
Study here allows us to see very clearly the outcome of Rawlsian theory, and that's why there are a lot of public policy people who work in Rawlsian theory, and even in healthcare theory, people like Norman Daniels, for example, who does apply Rawlsian theory to the healthcare system. And clearly, if it is the case that all human beings have a right to access to healthcare, and this is the kind of thing people in a original position behind a veil of ignorance, not knowing their own conditions, would provide for themselves collectively, which seems intuitively strong. As we know, all democracies on earth have universal health care except the United States. It's a strong moral intuition. Even a vast majority of United States citizens think that all United States citizens should have access to health care. It's a strong moral intuition, and the original position allows us to see why, for the reasons that you both have mentioned. If you don't know what life is going to bring you, you would want a situation where whatever it brings you, you at least have access to health care, and you would be more than willing that all other people would have that same access.
One of my professors in my PhD program, Bruce Landesman, had a way of kind of looking at that chart, and he would say, let's think of those things that we all enjoy in a society, those things that are so very important to us. So, Carrie, maybe I'll start off with and say, I think it's very important for all of us to have roads. What's something else you think it's important for us to have?
Traffic lights.
Okay, traffic lights for the roads. And how about you, Rhonda?
I'd like sidewalks on the side of them.
Okay, all right. Okay, and let's move away from roads. And do you want any kind of government with this system? I mean, we're going to pay for this. So we're kind of starting at the bottom. Or would you rather just start with a police force or something, Luke?
Sure, let's have a government.
Okay.
And maybe I'd like to throw in freedom of speech, if that's okay with you. I
Okay.
mean, not to
Man, he's liberal.
far
I don't
ahead.
know. You're getting liberal on us here. How about you, John? What do you want to add to it?
Let's go with freedom of religion. And I mean, it's important to Rawls to maintain an idea of the good, and I think that's important to a lot of people to maintain an idea of the good.
Okay, thanks. And some other things that Landesman will put on this list is that we have a right to happiness. We have a right to a common defense. He doesn't know if it needs, how elaborate this needs to be, but we all need to be protected by it. And if maybe some folks didn't want a city government, at least we probably need a police force to help us so that we can keep the...
We all are happy we can dial 911.
We are.
And if that was privatized, we wouldn't want it.
And the founders of the country decided we were going to have an education system, that we were to be a well-educated electorate. And so these are all some real basics, that we start moving up and say, well, these things bring us a good life. These things bring us happiness. But then the next step might just be medicine. Do our people owed that right to medical care, to knowing that they don't have to worry, like Rhonda was, that your illness is just as bad as my illness, and that we're both entitled to medical care. How does that work, Michael?
Well, I'm unaware of any democratic theorist or any liberal theorist who doesn't think that it's a human right to have access to medical care. So I think the fact that it isn't available universally in the United States is an indication that we live in a plutocracy more than a democracy. And that is a country governed by the wealthy.
All right.
Clearly, without a doubt, from Rawlsian theory, but from all democratic and liberal theory, you get the notion of people having come together in political society for their mutual benefit, and there are certain things that are too big, too complex, too important to do alone. Policing ourselves, we want to dial 911. We don't want to want to live in the Old West and everyone carry a 6-gun on their hip. We want to have roads. We want to have traffic lights, and so there are ways to extend this thought. And as I've said, all other democratic peoples on earth extend it to the access to health care. That doesn't mean we have a right to be healthy. We just have a right for the opportunity to be healthy, just like we don't have the right to be happy, but we have the right to pursue happiness. And so I think there are a number of ways as societies evolve and democracies progress, the people talk about these things. And I happen to think we're not too far away from a time when healthcare will be universally accessible in the United States, because it's too wasteful, it's too inefficient, it's too burdensome in addition to being immoral that we don't.
Thank you. I've read others who say the same. Did you have a comment, John?
Yeah, just real quick going with the healthcare thing. I think, like you're saying, in our present situation, it would be easier for the wealthy child to get a cure for a serious illness than it would be for the poor child. And you mentioned public policy workers that are working with Rawlsian theory. Is that the kind of way that Rawls advocated change, was through working through public policy and that type of thing? I mean, is that what he would want done to bring about his kind of theory of justice?
Well, Rawls used democracy and the idea of democracy in 3 different respects, actually, but I'll mention 2 of them. One is he means the kind of government that societies might have. Secondly, he means the kind of societies that societies might be. And so he believes that just insofar as people work together to create a just society as he envisions it, as he theorizes it, it would happen at both levels simultaneously. And that is to say that, of course, government is going to have to function in particular ways. Certain laws are going to have to be written, you know, and so on. But that's not sufficient, because moral and democratic power percolates up into government far more than it trickles down from government. So he envisions, first and foremost, a liberal democratic society where people broadly share certain moral intuitions, the kind that we've been discussing here, and that will affect the kind of government they choose for themselves. Because government isn't an alien entity in a society like ours, theoretically. That is to say that government is simply a means we choose to collectively do some things that we believe we need to do collectively.
Excellent question, excellent response. And let's pull up our next graphic because it'll help us unpack this. And Carrie, I'll have you read this one again for us as well.
Justice and ignorance. The principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance. This ensures that no one is advantaged or disadvantaged in the choice of principles by the outcome of natural chance or the contingency of social circumstances.
And the next one as well, please.
All similarly suited. Since all are similarly suited and no one is able to design principles to favor his particular condition, the principles of justice are the result of a fair agreement or bargain. This initial situation is fair between individuals as moral persons, that is, as rational beings with their own ends and capable, I shall assume, of a sense of justice.
Thank you. And so this ties so well into the question then that John just asked and that was just answered by Michael. And is there a way that we can make public policy move forward and the study of public policy and truly become public policy? I guess this is going to be your major at Harvard, isn't it, Luke?
Yes, it is.
How do we do this? Tricky thing, isn't it?
It is tricky. I think that Michael made an excellent comment about the importance of democratic society. You can have public policy wonks formulating all kinds of, programs and things, but unless you have a vibrant democratic society, unless you have people participating in the process, then it's of little value and it deteriorates over time. One thing that's really important to Rawls is he uses this phrase that his theory works from one generation to the next. And that is essential, and the essential ingredient for that is having that sort of vibrant civil society. And, public policy can have an effect on encouraging people to be more involved through policies and programs that bring things more down to a grassroots level and encourage people to vote and to run for office and all of those sorts of things.
Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
John, would you mind reading our next graphic for us, please?
Which principles of justice? In working out the conception of justice as fairness, a main task clearly is to determine which principles of justice would be chosen in the original position.
So does this tie into the comment that you wanted to make as well? You were kind of, it looked like you were wanting to respond to Luke.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's pretty clear in here that he wants to work from the original position, and that's going to inform how we construct things. So social change should almost look back. I mean, social organizations, grassroots social organizations, and public policy workers should look back at the original position as informing the changes they're trying to make in society from a Rawlsian perspective, right?
That's correct. So well done. And we always remember that we've got to be representing the students who are taking this as distance education students. And so do any of you have questions that you think maybe the students might be having at this time? For me, it just gets more and more clear as we move on. But is you doing okay with it, Luke?
Yeah, I think it may be important, I was thinking this from the beginning, to define liberal the way that we've been using it, because it has
well, and
possibly a couple connotations.
Michael and I have both done some great research on that. So should I start and you finish up?
Whatever you say, you're in charge.
I think that when we start looking at our Enlightenment theorists, that we can see that those who, such as Kant, Hobbes, Mill, and others, believed very strongly that in a liberal tradition, that we needed to be able to have a freedom. We needed to be able to make decisions for ourselves without a religion making those decisions for us. That very much our tradition then is, when you use the word liberal, it doesn't mean you're a Democrat or a Republican, but actually in the true terms of political philosophy means that there are freedoms, that some basic freedoms and some basic moral guidelines that we all agree on. Would you like to
I'll say
tell how you...
a bit more. Liberal theory began in the 17th century as a consequence of, more than any other one thing, the Protestant Reformation, whereby individuals as individuals became to be seen as Elaine said, so valuable, so important, that not only should they be coerced by religion, but they should not be coerced by the state. And so the liberal tradition puts at its heart the value of individuals as such. Now, as this develops, there develops also a wariness about the powers of the state. And there also develops, because of the importance placed on individuals, the idea that societies can evolve and progress and work together collectively, democratically, so as to institutionalize and promote and protect the kinds of rights and the kinds of goods that human beings ought to be able to pursue in their life and ought to be able to live by. And so that's the second movement of the liberal tradition, which is of great importance. And so that's what we mean when we speak of a liberal theory or liberal tradition.
And so those of us in political philosophy would say, whether you're Republican or Democrat, you would very much embrace this liberal theory. And it's very old, goes back to our days of Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, Descartes, just moving on through, who felt the individual very important, as you mentioned. Thank you.
Persons are free and equal, moral, rational beings. And government institutions, religious institutions, and societal institutions ought to promote and protect that moral status that we have.
Oh, that's perfect. I think we should have that as a test question. Well done. Okay, let's pull up our next couple of graphics. And Rhonda, would you read these for us, please?
Principles for justice and fairness. Justice requires equality in the assignment of basic rights and duties.
And the next one?
Fairness holds that social and economic inequalities, for example, inequalities of wealth and authority, are just only are just only if they result in compensating benefits for everyone, and in particular for the least advantaged members of society.
Now, are we starting to hit a controversial point here, where we're looking at opportunities need to be fair, and especially they need to be fair for the least advantaged members of society? Why is it so important to privilege the statement this way, John? You want to pass to Luke?
Yeah, let's pass to Luke.
Okay.
I think it's important for Rawls to have certain things established as absolute, I think, and that for him, he, in the full, theory of justice, he establishes that certain things are going to need to be equal for certain, and among those are some of the things we talked about, but also very important to him are political rights, and so everybody should be able to vote and have equal access to, like he says, offices and so forth, and that is essential to him. And it can be kind of like I was saying earlier. It can be difficult to determine some of the other areas. Where do you draw the line? Where's the gray area?
Well, in fact, let me expand this just a little bit more, and that might make it easier for John to even comment on it. But he says we've got these two principles of justice, and they're going to support this comment that was just read. Would you read these two from Rawls for us, Carrie?
Each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with similar liberty for others. Number 2, social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both A, reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage, and B, attached to positions and offices open to all.
Okay, so Michael, why is this such an important point for Rawls about what we must do with social and economic inequalities and how he says they must be arranged?
It's important for Rawls. It's the heart of his theory because he believes it's the only way that a society can honor, protect, and promote our status as equal and free human beings. That is that we have a moral character inextricably as human beings, which politics is meant to protect and to institutionalize. And this is the way that is done. It's the proper kind of balance of freedom for all and the diversity of a plural society whereby we can pursue our own life plans. And at the same time, it ensconces the moral commitment that, as I said earlier, random and arbitrary disadvantages and random and arbitrary advantages are morally problematic and should not have an overwhelming effect in our lives. And so there's this balance between what we might call Republican concerns of the common good and liberal concerns about individual liberty that he seeks to elaborate in his theory, but this is the summarization, the abstraction of his theory.
Thank you. So he's going to say certainly we're not going to have, we're not going to have this veil of ignorance. But he says, for example, offices and positions must be open to all. So when I apply for a position, it's open to everyone. You need to meet those basic qualifications. But that position is going to be open to everyone, regardless of your economic position, your race, your handicap, whatever it might be. So for Rawls, then, this is very fundamental. And he starts saying, since we don't have this veil, how can we safeguard this? Let's look at the next two graphics. And Luke, could you read those for us, please?
Mm-hmm. All social values, liberty and opportunity, income and wealth, and the bases of self-respect are to be distributed equally unless an unequal distribution of any or all of these values is to everyone's advantage.
And the next one?
The distribution of wealth and income and the hierarchies of authority must be consistent with both the liberties of equal citizenship and equality of opportunity.
So, Michael, maybe what he's getting at here then is that we'll have someone who has a lot, a whole lot, and someone who doesn't have much, but if they just had a little bit more, maybe we could say health care. And the person up here didn't have to give up too much so that this child or whoever it might be could be helped, then it seems like he's going to say we have a more fair, we have a more just society. So he's saying, I don't want to come in and say, okay, we're all going to be this level playing field. But he's saying, isn't there something that we could do to take just a little from the top, wouldn't cause hurt, discomfort, that would help those who have so little?
Yes, he's not a Marxian theorist. He doesn't believe that all people should be, equal in every possible way. And neither is he a free market libertarian whereby the arbitrary and random aspects of life are just too bad for some and wonderful for others, and the chips fall where they may. He envisions a just society as emanating from our best moral intuitions that we would decide for ourselves, as having that leveling effect, not a complete leveling effect, but a moderate leveling effect, So and I might quickly mention one other thing, but he doesn't want things to be redistributed after the fact. He wants a just social and economic and political structure, because if you have the just structures, things don't have to be redistributed after the fact. The way that things get produced and distributed in the first place are moral.
Thank you. So wonderful way of tying this together. And for him, it's very fundamental and distinguishing for his position, that he is not a Marxist, and he is trying to find a middle ground, saying we should be able to do a little more for those who have so little. And let's go ahead and read our last graphic on this. And Carrie, would you read this, please?
Yes. Resulting gains. Not it is possible that by giving up some of their fundamental liberties, men are sufficiently compensated by the resulting social and economic gains. The general conception of justice imposes no restrictions on what sort of inequalities are permissible. It only requires that everyone's position be improved.
So Rhonda, what do you think about that?
I think it's a good idea. You know, that if we do have fundamental liberties and fundamental freedoms, that all of us ought to be able to come up to a certain level.
And certainly not be harming those who need to help out a little more
Exactly.
to make society a better place,
And I don't think that
place.
it does hurt the top, you know, to have the equality that those at this level, you know, the lower level automatically should have.
Okay, thanks. Well, Michael, we're coming to the end of our class period, and it has been a pleasure having you with us discussing Rawls' theory of justice.
Thank you.
And one last comment for the students?
Well, my comment is I'm very glad you're grappling with Rawls, and I encourage you to keep doing that. There's a great literature on Rawls, and it has led to a lot of very important thoughts that as you pursue moral theory and political theory and just being a responsible citizen, you know, there's a lot of value in his theory for you.
Absolutely, makes you all very well-educated persons. Thanks for being with us and helping us out today, and we'll now move on to business ethics and Adam Smith.
There you go.
Bye-bye.